Everyone, or sorry, good afternoon. Welcome to this session on qualitative research. It's nice to see so many people here at the start of a long weekend. Now we've given you all a handout that has a list of projects that our three qualitative researchers have worked on, in which they will refer to in their answers. That's just to give you a bit of a head start, so we don't need to repeat details. And now, we've got a number of questions, and this session is going to be structured with me moderating and asking our speakers to talk on the questions that they've already indicated a particular interest in. So if I can introduce you to Jeannine Stairmand, Moira Smith, and Moira Stubbe. Sorry. Yes, that's what it is. Okay, lovely. So our first quick round of questions is going to be just to ask, why do you like doing qualitative research?
Kia ora, everybody. Initially, it was simply that I like to listen to people's stories. I like to hear about other people's life experiences. So it was as simple as that for me. Coming from the community, I thought, and working in the health sector, that there needed to be more evidence that had come from the people rather than just numbers. So a bit of balance there. Māori culture is obviously oral based, so that was another appeal for me. And I think that qualitative research is provides essential evidence to help us understand what are quite often complex issues that we're trying to deal with. Kia ora.
Kia ora. I have to agree with Jeannine. I guess coming from a health background and working with people, I just really like working with people and hearing their stories, as Jeannine said. And I think it's just really important that we understand that, you know, what we're trying to either implement or change, we understand how that actually impacts the people that we're working with. And it also gives our participants the opportunity to be involved in the research a little bit more rather than just being a number on a page. So,
Well, all of the above. I'm sort of particularly drawn to qualitative research because when I've looked at the results of quantitative studies, I'm always interested in, I'm one of these annoying people that says, but why? Why is it like this? Or I have the other sort of, you know, more sort of searching questions to try and get those sort of explanations and find out the reasons behind the patterns. But also I have to confess that I am more drawn to engaging with people and their stories, as Jeannine said, and getting an insight into their experiences and their views of the world and what makes people tick and why people do and say the things that they do.
Okay, lovely. And now we're straight back to you with ethical issues. So we worry about ethics. Most people do what they're asked to enjoy it. So fire ahead.
Okay, so ethical issues. Quite often, I think we all have our own sort of internal sort of sets of ethics about how we carry out research, but there are also bureaucratic requirements, especially around any research involving human participants, but especially with health research. And so quite often when people talk about ethics, they will think of that as a bunch of annoying bureaucratic requirements and ethics committees as being a barrier to get past. And I confess that I used to sort of feel a little bit like that, except for the last 5-6 years I've been sitting on an ethics committee and I've realised that's not really what it's all about. But as a jobbing researcher, for me, what ethics is all about is actually, it's always been about making sure that the research is a two-way process. So I always start by thinking, why is this research going to be of any interest to the people I'm asking to spend their time helping me with it? What's in it for them? What could be in it for them? What could we give back? Either directly to the participants or indirectly, sort of in terms of the findings of the research. And I think qualitative research gives you an opportunity to engage with people in a very direct way, and it kind of puts those kind of ethical parameters right there in your face, because you're actually having to front up to people when you're interviewing them or recording their medical consultations, as I do, and so you've got to have some answers for those questions available. So why would I bother doing this? But in my experience, people actually enjoy being involved in research if they understand what it's about, and they're far less likely to turn you down as long as they feel that you're trustworthy and that you have got trustworthy processes in place. And so I think a lot of, if you actually just think about what's in it for the participants and how can I ensure that my research is trustworthy from their point of view, that I'm not going to misuse their information, that it's going to be used for good purposes, then I think, everything flows well from there.
Okay, so with the projects that I've been involved with, what I've learned from those is, of course, thinking about recruitment is absolutely essential from the word go, because whatever the outcome you achieve from your project, the meaningfulness of it is going to be influenced by the participants that you're able to recruit into your study, whether that's quant or qual. I think that kind of goes both ways. So obviously key internal people, which is easy for us perhaps here at the University of Otago, but also external people, particularly from within the fields that we might be wanting to research in. And the projects I've worked in, that's been in primary care and hospital-based services. So that has meant needing to have input or participation on our projects from people like GPs, oncologists, surgeons, to name a few. The way that our group in particularly has gone about trying to inform our recruitment strategies is by seeking advice from clinical advisory groups that we've set up and a community and Māori advisory group to help inform our thinking around that, because there's what we think happens and there's what actually happens out in the community and out in these organisations and within hospitals, within departments, within hospitals even, and their cultures and what can influence recruitment. There might be things that we just have no awareness of that might end up being quite critical to us being able to recruit people into our study. We're quite often forging new pathways, so it's a bit of a jungle sometimes when we're recruiting, and so we have to be careful about what we're doing, and so we need to be quite thoughtful about our recruitment processes. So getting into some real nitty-gritty micro thinking when we do that, I think is quite important. On occasion, other groups or people researchers may have been there and the relationships may not be that good there, or in fact they might be really good and you can write off the back of that. So kind of scoping the territory, I think, is another important part there. From our multimorbidity study, if I use that as an example, to actually recruit patients, we had to actually go back a few steps and recruit the PHOs that these patients were registered with. We had to recruit practices within those PHOs, GPs that were operating in those PHOs, because sometimes just because the practice had agreed, it didn't mean every individual GP had agreed. And so therefore within a practice you might have 3 GPs who said yes and 2 who said no. So you can recruit from some of the patients within that practice. And that's before you even get to send anything out to a patient like an invitation letter. So recruitment isn't always as easy as going straight to the person. Quite often you have to negotiate all of those. And so to do that, you need to have worked with key people in all of those positions. And then hopefully you're working as part of a team. And so there'll be people who have established relationships within those teams that can help. Key to what we found was helpful was being flexible in our approach, being persistent but not stalkerish with them, and trying to have the least impact on their everyday work activity so that we weren't taking too much time out of their already busy days. The fields that we were working in were quite often short-staffed, a lot of demand for their services, so we had to be particularly mindful of that. Maybe Moira might not comment on kids.
Kids are fun. Kids are great actually, and kids came, they were of a really neat age. They were 12 years old, roughly. And so they were really keen to be involved in our project. But like Jeannine said, we had to get through a whole number of different kind of gatekeepers and recruit first the schools and get the schools on board, and then we had to talk to the school community, make sure that everybody in the school was happy before we even got to the children, and then we spoke to the children and spent some time with them, but then of course they had to get their parents' permission. So there's quite a lot of talking. And what we found with recruitment, actually, what we did is we started with those schools that we knew that we could work with, that we were familiar with, who trusted us. And so we developed our recruitment strategy. We kind of knew, we knew what we were doing, but we refined it with those that we could possibly make a little bit of a mistake with, and it was okay, so that by the time we got to the end, we were actually really good at it. And it was just really important to build up that trust, I think, with the school and the school community. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just sort of just to add an example. So the work that we do involves, a lot of it involves recording health interactions, and in one particular study we was quite touched on a few of those things. We wanted to record interactions that were mediated by an interpreter, and then we wanted to interview all the participants afterwards. So it was actually logistically incredibly challenging and ethically challenging as well. So for a start, there were 4 researchers descending on a very, very busy practice. And so there were actually just logistical issues about where we were going to do these things. But the recruitment process, which is what we're focusing on here in particular, was very challenging, because the people that we wanted to, the patients who we wanted to recruit, by definition, spoke very little English. And so it was, and we didn't have a particular target group in mind, so just translating information sheets or invitation letters wasn't an option. So there was a lot of negotiation with the practice, with the clinicians at the practice, also with the ethics committee and with the professional interpreters body, about what would be a safe and logistically feasible way to do this. And so in the end, we devised a strategy whereby we were working with patients who were regular patients in this particular practice, so the clinicians knew who would or wouldn't be more or less appropriate to work with, and the interpreters involved assisted with the informed consent process when the patients arrived at the practice. And we took from there, and we had to go back and forth many times to various stakeholders in this to sort of make sure that we were proceeding in a way that was ethical and safe, and not too burdensome on the participants.
Okay, over to Moira and to talk about
Costing.
Costing.
Costing, yeah. So there's, all research is costly. I guess there's a number of different costs involved. So of course there's financial cost. And Maria mentioned translation, which reminded me that, if you're working with communities for whom English is not their first language, then often you have to spend some money and do some translation or work with a translator. And also thinking about recruitment. For Kids Cam, for instance, before we even spoke to the children, we had already travelled to the schools twice. So there's travel costs involved, and trips out to Porirua can become a bit expensive time and time again. And then of course you've got the added costs of recruitment, and then we had to go out and collect the data, and then we had to go back and talk to the children, and then we had to go back and thank the principals in the schools, and with Kohard and various other things. So there's that. There's the time cost as well. So you just have to allow time. I think Maria has the story of thinking that maybe you could get 2 focus groups or 2 interviews done in a day, but when you're in Auckland you can only get 1 done because it's an hour and a half to one place, and then you get stuck in traffic, and so you have to think about that. And there's also a cost to the researchers, I think, personally in some situations, and maybe Jeannine can talk more about this, but I know that sometimes in interviews, it does take a lot out of you, actually, just sitting there having to concentrate, listen to what's being said, think on your feet quite quickly sometimes, and be adaptable. And then sometimes participants will come out with something from left field that you haven't expected, and sometimes it can be quite personal. So you have to think, how am I going to deal with this? And how do you keep your interview back on track when you've had this thing come out of nowhere? So maybe Jeannine.
I might just talk a little bit about the personal cost, if you like, but benefits potentially as well. And if I think about the C3 cancer study, so some of the participants that we recorded their consultations and then interviewed them after, had a very poor diagnosis and were going to die probably quite soon after they'd been interviewed. And they shared a lot of information about themselves, their family, their circumstances. And in some ways, it seemed like participating in our research gave them a bit of an outlet after quite a stressful consultation. And over a cup of tea and a biscuit, it's surprising what people will tell you about some very personal and deep things in their life. And so taking that on, I think is part of that interaction, and then afterwards reflecting on what has happened in that consultation. You're only one part in a piece of time. You're more than likely not going to have any further interactions with that person, but you will have their stories and their data for probably at least 10 years, depending on your ethics. And so you may actually come across them again. Maybe their diagnosis isn't terminal, and you might see them in the supermarket. So you might have an ongoing relationship, and that might take the form of just a smile, a nod of the head, raise of the eyebrows. They might want to stop and talk to you, or completely blank you, or not remember you at all. And all of that is good. And so there's that kind of personal cost / benefit to it. I think that teaches us a lot about other people and the things that they're going to. So I do confess to a little while after that being a lot more tolerant in traffic on my drive to work, particularly around the basin when people were driving poorly. I'd be like, I just don't have any idea what's going on in the person's life in front of me. They could be going to a consultation where they're going to hear that, they might have 3 months to live, and here I'm being annoyed because they're tailgating me or something like that. And so I need to just chill out a little bit because we just don't know what's happening in other people's lives, and it could be really big, and we've got annoyed with them about a silly little thing. So, kia ora.
Jeannine, I think you had a really good story, though, about something that, in a sense, went wrong to you.
Oh, I think that's the when things go wrong story. So my first phone call to recruit someone in the C3 study was to an elderly gentleman. He was a retired hospitality worker. He had immigrated out to New Zealand probably some 60 odd years prior, but still had quite a strong accent. And so Eminem's song came to mind when I was writing myself notes about this. If you've heard the lyrics to Lose Yourself, so my palms were sweaty, my knees were weak, and my arms were heavy. And I was nervous, but on the surface, I'm sure I looked calm and ready. And so what happened after I introduced myself and gave him the pre-prepared blurb about the purpose of my call? The gentleman says to me, "No one's told me I've got cancer." And I think to myself, as my brain explodes, what the F am I going to do about this? And so it was quite interesting to write myself some notes about this, because it made me think about what was going around in my head at the time, as my head was probably spinning around on my shoulders. Thankfully, he couldn't see me. And while I was still swearing to myself, at the same time, I was going, we didn't cover this in the training. How can he not know? The hospital research coordinator who set this up for me was supposed to have got me people who had been given their diagnosis. So I was not very happy. And how am I going to get myself out of the shit? Because I was, a little bit panicky. And now I freaked him out. He could be angry and upset. And this is not the way people should find out, if in fact this is the way he's found out that he's got cancer. So then I tell myself, calm, 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 take a breath. Then I go, so can I just check that you have an appointment next week in the Blood and Cancer Centre? Is that on Tuesday at 1 o'clock? And he says, yes, I do. And then the conversation proceeded on from there. And I thought, phew, I still don't know how I'm going to get out of this because it's still not right. And then later on, the conversation came back around to him not knowing about his diagnosis. And so I said to him, well, how about, he's like, I've got some letters and stuff, but no one's actually told me. And I'm like, well, how about you bring your letters and stuff in and we'll have a look at it because we have to meet before the consultation to sort out the written consent side of things. And we'll have a look at your paperwork and you know, take it from there pretty much. And so he did that. So Louise Signal, who was the PI for the project, and I both met with him and we had a look at the letters that he had, and yes, it was there in the writing, but it was in medical terminology. And so we I was like, of course we understood then this is partly why he hasn't really understood that he has this diagnosis. And when you say Blood and Cancer Centre, well, he had been having some anemia. And so he could have simply been thinking he had something wrong with his blood because it was the Blood and Cancer Centre. So you start to think actually from non-medical, non-hospital based people, what your average Joe blogs, if you like, can be thinking. So that was my first phone call. Things got better after that.
Okay, so let's go on and talk about recording. And I'd just like to say about Jeannine's story, I think actually that really illustrates one of the really valuable things about qualitative research, which is you don't know what you don't know. And as medical people who are working in a medical institution, we tend to find it very hard to understand how difficult it may be to understand us and our institution.
Recording. Yep. You only get one opportunity really to record your data. And if you forget to turn the recorder on, you don't get your data. So my rule is always have 2 recorders because sure as eggs, the batteries will die in one. Or as an experienced researcher recently did, forget to turn one of them on. So, or think that you turned them on and you hadn't. So thank goodness I had 2 and was able to get the recording. It's, you know, ideally you'd want to be sitting in a quiet room with just the other people and soundproofed completely, but that's actually rare. For Kids Camp, for instance, we interviewed 33 of the children, and as many of you will know, schools are very, the space in schools sometimes is quite scarce, and it's a noisy place. And I didn't do any of the interviews, but Louise came back one day and said she had this amazing interview with this one child, and literally in a cupboard, because they were literally in the cupboard with the broom. And on the other side, they were doing some kind of physical activity, and it involved Michael Jackson and Thriller. And and the recording and the transcript came back, and the transcriber said, "Could you please find a quieter room because I couldn't hear the recording." And no, actually, can't find a quieter room. That was what we were given. And another project I've been on recently, we were interviewing mums of preschoolers, and we had great facilities actually at a preschool. You know, we went after, you know, at night time. But of course, who looks after the babies and the children at night time? So they came along too, which was fine. And of course, there were toys in the corner, which was great, but of course they were noisy and there were drums. And so there's all of this going on. And you're trying to concentrate and think about what you're trying to say to and ask these people. But also you're constantly thinking, oh no, the recording, you know. So it's really important, I think, just to make sure that you've got space on your recorder, that you've got batteries, that you have as quiet a space as possible. Sometimes you have to ask people to speak up. But of course you don't want to interrupt the flow of what's going on. Recording, I haven't had a lot of experience of video recording. I think maybe Maria, you have?
Well, we do video recording, and we're not Luke Pilkington-Chin. and we're not experts, so we use little handy cams, and we are putting them into little tiny consulting rooms often, and you have to be pretty clever to try and figure out the camera angles, and sometimes there's very little room for error, and we've got quite a few recordings where people have said to us, why are we only seeing the back of the patient's head? Well, it was either the back of the patient's head or the back of the doctor's head, or actually we did have them both in shot, but then one of them moved their chair back 8 inches, and that was that. But we also always have at least two recording devices, so a camera with its own mic, but then also a digital recorder as close as possible to the midpoint between the people who we're recording, and if it's a consultation in particular, so we always have the backup. In our early days, we thought that because the clinicians were particularly concerned about privacy issues, and so we'd angle the camera away. We just accepted we weren't going to get a video recording, obviously, of the physical examination, so we'd angle the camera away, but some of the clinicians were still concerned about that, so they'd want to turn the camera off. And then, of course, what would happen is that they'd forget to turn the camera back on. So we at least would still have the audio recording because we had the second audio recording device. But actually, we decided after that we'd go low tech. And so we had a very, we used to say this is a really high tech way of ensuring privacy. We had a nice brightly coloured tea towel, and this was part of the kit that got carried around. And that was kind of just draped over the back of the camera, free of the microphone, so that if at any time the participants were happy for an audio recording to continue but didn't want the video, but one or other of the clinician or the patient could just pop the tea towel down over the camera lens, and then it was a really obvious visual cue to them that that had happened, and they'd pop it back up. So after that, we didn't unintentionally lose too many more recordings. There were the what can go wrong stories. So there was my colleague Lindsay, who collected a lot of our data, and she came back and she said, I just did the most wonderful interview, and that's the good news. The bad news is I forgot to turn on the camera. So this happens sometimes. The other thing with recording is remember that you can record yourself. So years and years ago, I was doing a project that involved fieldwork all over New Zealand, and my practice when I do an in-depth interview is as soon as I can after the interview, before it ever gets transcribed or anything, I do a kind of brain dump, and I just scribble notes. I go to a cafe or somewhere and just dump down all my impressions, and that's a really good time saver when it comes to doing your initial analysis. But on this particular occasion, I had to drive from somewhere in the Bay of Plenty to Rotorua Airport to catch my plane, and I couldn't do that, and I knew I was going to lose some of these ideas. I was buzzing. I'd been there in a particular school for a whole day, and so I had the bright idea of just turning the recorder on beside me in the car, and I talked to myself for the whole hour and a half that I drove back to Rotorua Airport. Everybody probably thought I was completely bonkers, but nevertheless, that's what I did. And the transcriber said, that was really interesting, she said, actually, transcribing the interviews, and then, it was a whole day's worth, and then you just crystallised it into an hour's worth of recording. And I looked at it, and really I hadn't missed that much. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to say I find recording myself really helpful as well, and it's getting easier and easier to do. So back to you on handling data and being organised. I think you've got a paper available on that.
Well, yeah, so on your little handout at the bottom, I've just sort of put a thing in about the data set that we've created called the Arch Corpus of Health Interactions. So collecting health encounter data on video and going through all the ethical processes, it's very time and resource intensive, but also in the space of a single project, which you might be funded for 1, 2 or 3 years, you can't actually hope to extract all the goodness out of that data that might be available. And so quite early on in the course of our project, we came up with the idea, because I come from a linguistics background where people do these sorts of things, so this was before the age of big data really, that we would try and set things up so that we could seek consent from participants to retain the data that we collected for future reuse for research and educational purposes, subject to ethical approval for new unrelated projects. And initially people said to us, oh, nobody's ever going to agree to that, and no ethics committee is going to agree to that. But actually, you'd be surprised that, you do have to be, very careful. And one of the things we had to be very careful to design into our projects right from the start was those sort of assurances about how we would look after the data, what systems we would have in place to safeguard the data, also for our own sanity, having good systems set up over time that would allow us to retrieve the data as it grew in size. But we had to build as much of that in as we could to our information sheets and consent forms, and of course we've got smarter about that at the beginning, and we've come to realise that you never actually know what's going to come up in the future. It didn't occur to us in the early years that we would ever want to even be able to make use of this data anywhere other than here on campus, because it was all going onto computers that were based here. There weren't flash drives yet that could take large video files. That's no longer the case. So we're having to start to address some of the same issues that are sort of the people who have the large national health data sets and the IDI and so forth are grappling with, if there are people overseas who want to use the data, is that permissible or not? What will an ethics committee say about that? What will the original participants say about that, who you no longer can ask in many cases? So yes, I have written a paper about the protocols that we've developed. So we've got very rigorous protocols and management systems in place, and we curate the data as well as we can using a number 8 wire approach. We're still trying to persuade the university to help us with something that's a little bit more robust going forward. So that's watch this space. It also ties in to the funding, because it's all, Tony Dow, who was sort of one of the co-directors of the corpus, used to say the Arch Corpus, it's not like the horse with no name, it's the project with no funding. Because we never had any explicit funding to do that work, so we had to kind of cleverly build that component into our research design, that we were, and then later, of course, we've been able to cleverly build it in the other way around to say, well, we've already got some baseline data that we can start with, and then we're going to go and collect some more to do this particular thing. So thinking ahead is a really important thing to do with this. Planning ahead right at the design stage, when you're still putting the proposal together, then if you get the funding, putting a lot of thought into this kind of stuff when you're preparing all your research and ethics documentation, and trying to have as many options, and then backing that up with a really good, a really well-designed access database is what we use, for example, and thinking, people used to come in and say, you're a bunch of nerds, because we'd have an hour-long meeting deciding how we were going to name the files from this project so that they'd self-sort into the Windows directories. Well, okay, that was 2 hours of a meeting, but 15 years later, we're still reaping the benefits of that work, and we've got a whole system set up. So happy to share that. Try and set it up to be as flexible and open as possible. And for a long time, people said, well, aren't you exploiting your participants? Because you've got other people, you've got PhD students, other people wanting to use this data. And so we actually put that to some of our participants and said, we'd be really upset if you didn't use this information that you've collected from us. We gave it to you. Well, yeah, it was an interesting project, but you told us that it was going to be really useful for educating health professionals or for doing other research that you hadn't thought of yet, and that's part of the reason we did it. So, that's actually the other side of the coin. People really wanted the stuff to be useful, and increasingly ethics committees are asking this question as well. Why are you going to throw your data away after 5 years or 10 years? So think ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Now, our last question was going to be the single most joyful moment in a recent research project, but we're actually going to move on to questions, and maybe you could integrate some joyful moments into the answers to the questions. So can I ask for questions, please?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Getting information back to interviewees. Okay, we want to do it, but the practicalities and the extent of it, and how do you do it, and so on, when, and
Yeah, it's a good question actually, and it is difficult. I think it's actually one of the most difficult things sometimes to do, is to go back to your participants. Sometimes you can use it as part of your study design, so that's sometimes quite a good way to do it, and your data collection. But we've tried to go back to the schools as much as we can with KidsCam and feedback to them about what we found. We could probably do it better. And feeding back to key stakeholders, if we've interviewed key stakeholders, and having workshops, that's sometimes quite a good way to do it. I don't know about the others.
The approach we've taken in the C3 team is in the form of summaries, because quite often there's been a number of people involved. And so we've done summaries for patients as well as summary for clinicians, because they might have different information interests. That's kind of how we've handled it so far.
It's difficult too, isn't it? Because sometimes your participants move on. Like our children have all gone now to high school, and they're kind of lost to the ether sometimes. So we ask all our participants if they want to have the findings of the research, and so they can tick the box, and we send it back and get letters back. Not mailed, return to sender kind of thing. So there is that.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's about giving people the opportunity to be involved if they want to. So even, giving people the opportunity to check their interview transcripts if it's an interview. But most people actually don't want to bother with it. And if you actually build that into your design as a must-have of your design, you're actually asking for trouble. So again, give options and give people the opportunity to ask for it. And sometimes if it's a particularly sensitive topic, or if you've said that you might want to use, like as we've done for some of our studies where we wanted to use clips from interviews to produce an online resource, we've actually said to people, that we will send you back your transcripts, and please identify any sections that you do not wish us to ever use, and we give them a variety of options of how to use. But in terms of dissemination, yes, similar strategy. So engaging with practice teams sometimes. So we offer a workshop, and we ask individual participants if it's okay to use clips from their recordings in some cases for those workshops, and give them the option, preparing a summary, but also actually engaging with public forms of dissemination, because I've been involved in a number of studies. People have come back to me years and years later, and they said, I've just been following what you did when you came into our workplace and recorded our meeting, and I just saw this publication, and there was a press release about it in the Dominion Post recently, and it's really interesting. You're still doing that stuff. So people do actually pay attention, and so I think it's all part of a dissemination strategy.
Thanks, Ed. And can we have some joyful moments?
I've got a related question. Do you ever make the promise to participants that you'll individually notify them of publications, or do you more tend to rely on the public dissemination that you mentioned?
Okay. No, well, we've never tended to do that, partly because the publications are often going to be published in very specialist kind of journals that won't necessarily make a lot of sense to participants. So I don't know, and that applies to our practitioner participants as much as to our patients. If I'm going to publish something in a conversation analysis journal, they're probably not going to be able to make a lot of sense of it anyway. But we do routinely say, would you like to be informed of the findings of the study? And if people we produce a report, a sort of lay report, that might only be 2 or 3 pages long. And then we give people links to our website, so if they're interested, they can look up.
So you'd follow up with an individual email with a kind of summary or something, or a link to the summary.
If people have requested it, we do it on request basis.
Yeah. And just with what you said about the opportunity to amend transcripts, just wondered about the practicalities of that. You mentioned that it doesn't happen very often, but I've seen people in their study designs factoring that in, and I've wondered about how you would manage that if it kind of happened en masse. It sounds like it doesn't typically happen.
If people want to look at their transcript.
Yeah, and then want to actually change what was actually said in the interview, perhaps to something else.
Okay, so we're sort of really clear that it's not about them changing what was said in the interview, but they could make a comment, or they could say, we don't want you to use this in any quotes or any audiovisual clips or whatever. But obviously, you can't change the data.
Yeah, so you specify, you kind of give a little bit of
But actually, most often people feel it is burdensome. We tend to think of it, we should be doing informant checking and all of that, but most people really don't want particularly to be bothered with it, to be honest. Most often our experience has been that people will come back and they'll correct what they see as the spelling errors and the grammatical errors in their transcripts, because they're used to seeing written English, not spoken English written down.
just on Kids Cam, for instance, all the children had the opportunity to go through their images that they took before we got to see them. So that was the arrangement for their privacy. That was part of our ethical approval. And also the parents didn't see them either, because we didn't want the children to think that they were being surveilled. So, so the children got the opportunity to go through their images, and it took about between 30 and 40 minutes normally to go through the 4 days worth or whatever their data was. And they could then take out what they, if there were any sensitive images, they could then delete those. So they were instructed at the time that, that if they were in the bathroom or something like that, they could turn their camera off. And if they'd forgotten, perhaps, or something like that. But I know my colleague Viliami Poloka, when we were in Tonga, the children were very concerned that Grandma wasn't looking nice and wasn't dressed appropriately. So they would start editing, like you said, they start editing not the text file, but obviously they start editing out these pictures. And so you think, no, that's not what we want, actually. So yeah.
Okay, look, I'm just going to finish up by asking a question myself, which is, what about some really joyful moments?
Sometimes, we use text as data, but sometimes you'll sit there in an interview and somebody will say something and you go, oh, yes. That's the gem from that interview, and that's actually really neat when you have that moment. I think I quite like that. And it was just fun, especially in Kids Cam, you go out and the kids were so excited and pleased to be part of everything. And we had a couple of letters from kids back, just saying thank you so much. And actually on one of the images that we had from the children, one of the girls had written a note, thank you very much, University of Otago team, for involving us in this really exciting project. And you just, you're flicking through randomly through these images and you find this and you think, yeah, that's really cool. So.
For multimorbidity and cancer, joyful. No, it's not all that bad, really. I think as the researcher, the joyful part really is hearing people when they express that they are happy to have had someone listen who was interested and wanted to listen to their story. That's probably, I think, a joyful part when we're talking about multimorbidity and cancer.
Joyful moment.
Oh, well, there is a real joy in doing qualitative research. I mean, there's all the usual joys of research, which are the fun parts, which is why we keep doing it, not the boring parts like writing grant applications and editing papers after the third rejection or whatever. But it's actually just the joy of engaging with people, and when people feed directly back to you that actually being part of that process has made a difference to them personally, or that they can see that what you're doing might make a difference to other people, which is also actually fundamentally what usually motivates people to get involved in the first place. And this wasn't one that I was the PI on this project, but someone else was doing the interview, and we were talking to people about their experience of having lived with type 2 diabetes over a number of years. So that's one of the projects I've summarised on here. And the interview went on for nearly 2 hours, and at the end of it, the person, the interviewer said, "Well, thank you so much, for being so open and sharing and letting us make use of your reporting." And this participant said, "No, the thanks should go the other way. This is the first time anybody's ever sat down and listened to me tell my story. It's the first time I've actually told my story. And you've sat there and listened to it for nearly 2 hours. I'm so grateful to you." And to me, that was really a really joyful anecdote to hear back, because for that individual, they'd actually, we didn't feel like we were just kind of eavesdropping on someone else's life, that actually we'd given something back quite directly. So that to me was really, really great.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd like to say that I think one of the things, the major thing that qualitative research can do for us is that there's known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And qualitative research is there to find out what we really don't know and what we really don't understand and to learn about it. and to feed that back into people doing forms of research where you actually don't get the chance to really think about the unknown unknowns or to do anything about them because you've got the data and that's what you have to work with. Now, I'd just like, before we finish, to hand over to Moira to tell us about the Journal Club.
Yes, just advertising the Journal Club. I think 26th of June. Our Journal Club, Methods Journal Club's going to be about qualitative research and rigour in qualitative research. So come along. We'll send out a reading about a week beforehand, and so have a read of that. Come along and we can have a chat and talk more about qualitative research.
Thank you all for coming, and let's thank our participants.